remark. We will be recording this session. So if that's not acceptable for you, then this would be the unfortunate time to leave. So hopefully everybody stays, and then we can formally kick it off. Thanks for joining clients, relations, and colleagues, and that you're here in our webinar. My name is Erwin van der Bree. I'm a partner in the tax practice of PwC in the Netherlands and responsible for the PwC Netherlands Transportation and Logistics team. And together with my colleague Julian Marelis, I focus on the maritime sector, and in that light, would like to welcome you to our webinar on the EU ETS and its consequences for especially the global maritime industry. Most of you will have heard of the EU ETS, which is and will soon be impacting many industries and hence also us. And therefore, we've taken the initiative to inform you and update you on the EU ETS, especially in relation to the maritime sector. And together with our EU ETS expert colleagues of PwC Netherlands, who jointly form our EU Green Deal Excellence Center, we've prepared a presentation for you. They will take you along the recent developments and most important aspects of the expansion of the EU ETS to the maritime industry. And with that, I would therefore like to hand it over to my colleagues Juliette Parcet, Mohamed Assouag, and Jonathan Banks, who will demonstrate the significant impact of the EU ETS on the maritime industry to you. We really hope you enjoy this session and that it provides you with valuable insights. Please do not hesitate to drop questions in the chat function. We will be discussing these at the end of the presentation. So handing it over to Jonathan.
Great, thank you very much, Erwin, and good afternoon, good morning, and welcome everybody. Before we dive into the webinar itself, just a little bit more housekeeping, and I'll quickly run through the agenda for today. So we've started off with an introduction, then I'll take you through a little bit of background to the EU emissions trading system. That's good. That was my next piece of housekeeping, was please do mute yourselves and turn your camera off just so that we can kind of have a smooth presentation. As I said, we'll talk about the EU ETS Maritime, so Julia and Mohammed will take you through that. We'll have some time for questions, so as I said, please do submit your questions via the chat or Q&A function as we go, and we'll try and answer all of those at the end. And then the other note would just be that, as Erwin said, the session is recorded and that the content that we cover today is a general information purposes only and does not constitute or substitute consultation with professional advisors. So with that in mind, let's jump into a little bit of background to the EU emissions trading system, how we find ourselves here today, and then some upcoming changes which are going to impact the system more broadly. So starting off with the EU Green Deal. Now, the EU Green Deal is the EU's ambitious plan to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. To achieve that, there are a series of policies and regulations that have been applied. Most of that is around carbon pricing, and that's what we're really focusing on today is the EU emissions trading system. So the EU emissions trading system, it's existed since 2005, so coming up to nearly 20 years. It currently limits physical installations within the European Union, and that's about 10,000 of them, as well as commercial airlines that fly within the European Economic Area. As a subpart of the existing EU ETS, there's also the Monitoring, Reporting and Verification, or MRV regime, and that's actually applied to certain elements of the maritime transport sector since 2018. Now, as Mohammed will show you, this has been expanded, so it's going to become relevant to more areas of the maritime industry and will also be expanded in terms of breadth and scope and what's required. So in addition to the EU ETS, which effectively applies domestic carbon pricing, the European Union has also introduced CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, that applied from 1 October this year and is effectively a carbon border tariff for the importation of emission-intense goods. And so we've got the EU ETS applying a domestic carbon price, and we've got the CBAM applying a carbon price effectively overseas. In addition to those two cornerstone carbon pricing policies, there are a raft of others, and there's too many to go into today. But just to name a few, there are certain plastic taxes, subsidies, cash grants, regulations supporting renewable energy, decarbonisation, extended producer responsibility, just to name a few. So those exist in addition to our carbon pricing policies, And then we also have reporting policies. So things such as the CSRD, which you may have heard of, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and that applies to companies to try and increase the amount of transparency and sustainability target publication. So with that in mind, that the EU ETS exists within the frame of a whole bunch of policies, let's talk about the EU ETS in a bit more detail. So as I said, it's existed for 20 years now, and it applies to fixed installations, which is permanent operations within the European Union. Currently, we apply 2 tests for the EU ETS. We look at both the greenhouse gases that are emitted and the industries in scope. So when we talk about greenhouse gases, we're looking at carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and perfluorocarbons. And these typically come from electricity or heat generation or intensive industries. So we're talking our oil refineries, steelworks. You can see the rest of them on the slide there. You get the idea of what that's targeting. For nitrous oxide and perfluorocarbons, it's a little bit more targeted in terms of exactly what industries are in scope. But you can see how this has been applied to energy-intensive, carbon-intensive industries within the European Union. The EU ETS is what we refer to as a cap-and-trade system. And so whilst it is a carbon price, what that means is that there is a commodity of the EU ETS, and that's called an ETS allowance, otherwise abbreviated as an EUA. And that EUA equals 1 tonne, equals the right to emit 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. And so what happens is every year the European Union sets a new amount of EUAs, a new amount of allowances and emissions that are allowed, and that's the cap. And then the EU ETS is the trading platform which exists on top of that. Now, I'll give a very simple example of that trading on the next slide, but I also want to introduce the concept of free EUAs here. So as I said, an EUA grants the right to emit a tonne of carbon. However, there are certain industries which the European Union has thought at risk of carbon leakage. Now, carbon leakage refers to the risk that the industry relocates due to domestic carbon pricing. What that means is that the EU Commission currently allocates free EUAs or free rights to emit to those industries. Now, that's relevant because as of the next coming years, that's one of the key things that are going to change. So you can see at the graph on the slide here, we've got installation 1 and installation 2. Installation 1 receives free EUAs, and that's shown by the orange box on the left-hand side, or the yellow. And then they also have verified emissions. Now, in this example, their free EUAs are higher than their verified emissions, and so they have an excess amount of EUAs in any given year. Now, installation 1 can choose to hold on to those itself, or it can trade them. It may trade them with installation 2, for example. Installation 2 has been granted free EUAs, but has more verified emissions than what its EUAs allow. So it has a shortfall. It needs to purchase or acquire EUAs to make up that difference. And that is a very simple example of how the trading currently works under the EU ETS. Now, I appreciate that's quite broad, and we're here to talk about the maritime sector. So why is this relevant? Well, I'll draw your attention to the graph on the right-hand side of the slide. We've got 2 lines there, a dark orange line and the yellow line. Starting with the dark orange line, as I said, currently sectors have been given free EUAs by the Commission. Now, as CBAM, that carbon border tariff, phases in through from 2026 to 2034, the allocation of free EUAs phases out. As I said, CBAM is designed to prevent carbon leakage, to apply a global carbon price, and so the allocation of free EUAs phases out through till 2034. At the same time, we've got the light yellow line there, which represents the total amount of EUAs available. It's what we call the linear reduction factor, but really what that means is that in every year, from 2024 going forward, the total amount of new EUAs, which is the total amount of emissions that are allowed, reduces. If you follow that path through, it means that by 2039, there will be no new EUAs allowed. Again, why this is relevant is because EUAs are the commodity or the mechanism through which the EU ETS works. As the maritime industry joins the EU emissions trading system, you'll still need to start acquiring EUAs. And you can see there that over the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a sharp increase in demand as they are no longer being given out for free, and a reduction in supply as the total amount of new EUAs made available is reduced. That's all relevant as the maritime industry enters the system and needs to start acquiring EUAs for its emissions. So with that price pressure in the back of your mind, I will now hand over to Mohammed, who's going to take you through an introduction to the EU ETS and the monitoring, reporting and verification system.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. With that in mind, let's indeed discuss the ETS, which is basically the levy. But first, starting with the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification regulation. If you can jump to the next slide. Yes, so the MRV regime is in place as of 2018. Historically, it includes large ships with a gross tonnage of more than 5,000, which are loading or unloading cargo or passengers at ports in the European Economic Area, so not the European Union. And you need to monitor and to report on CO2 emissions and other relevant information. So to be compliant with the MRV, there are three elements. First, you need to monitor. That means that certain greenhouse gases, fuel consumption, and some other parameters like distance traveled, time at sea, and so on, need to be reported, need to be monitored. The second part is the reporting that has to be done on an annual basis. Each company that owns a ship must provide on an annual basis and their emissions, and those emissions must be verified. For each ship, it operates in the European Economic Area. This has to be done by 30 April each year for the previous calendar year. And then the verification, as I mentioned, and that needs to be done by June 30th each year. Basically verifying that the emissions that you're reporting on are actually accurate, and that's a third party that can do that verification for you. From January 2024, so next year, you will see that some changes will occur to the MRV. First, the emissions on which you need to report will be expanded from CO2 to also methane and nitrous oxide. And as of January 2025, it is that the MRV will also be applicable to smaller ships of a smaller tonnage than the 5,000 tonnage. So let's jump to the next slide. That gives you a very good overview of what is currently in and what will change. So as I mentioned already, under the current MRV, cargo ships of 5,000 tonnage or more are already in scope. We also see that, large passenger transport ships, like cruises, of course, are also in scope. As of 2025, the MRV will be expanded with offshore ships, also with a tonnage of 5,000 or more. And for the ETS, actually, so that is the other mechanism, that will be the case as of 2027. And as of 2025, for the smaller ships, the Commission has indicated its intention also to include these ships in the EU ETS, but that is something that will be decided later on. However, as for the MRV, these ships will also be in scope as of 2025. On the right side, you see some other ships for which they've decided, some are political choices, of course, to not include that in the scope, which are, for example, sailing ships, warships, rigs, icebreakers, but also fishing ships. If you can jump to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is actually just an interesting slide to show you some insight on the MRV annual report of 2021. This is basically based on a reporting period from 2018 to 2021. As you can see from the graph on the left, almost 70% of the reported emissions are from container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, and some other ships. Looking to the picture on the right, you can see that actually the top 15 countries by gross rate of freight handled in main EU ports in 2021 It is important to note that while this map shows the top 15 countries, there are, of course, many other countries which are expected for which the ETS maritime to be relevant for. Think of Latin America, Peru, Argentina, and Brazil also are in scope. This could also be relevant for Vietnam, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and India. Jumping to the next slide. Thank you. So the reason we wanted to start with the MRV for maritime is that, as you can see from this slide, the EU ETS has and will continue to mirror the MRV in terms of trajectory. Therefore, an understanding of the MRV should help demonstrate where the ETS is heading in the near future and what can be expected. As indicated by the colored circles, where the scope of the MRV has expanded, the same changes in the ETS will follow shortly. With respect to the smaller ships, which are included in the MRV, as I mentioned, as of January 2025, it is yet to be seen whether these will also be in scope in the ETS, but they are looking at it and a decision will be made as of 2026. I will now hand over to Juliette, and she will talk a little bit about the EU ETS maritime.
Thank you very much, Mo. And as Mo already clearly said, yes, ETS dives into what MRV is already doing. So what does that mean? So what if your ship is in scope for ETS? If your ship is in scope for ETS, then the shipping company has to surrender EUAs for the emissions in scope. And if you do not comply, then that may result in penalties or even the refusal of the port that you are going into. So it's quite important to make sure that you actually comply with EU ETS. So that brings us to what is a shipping company. And I think that's the first thing that's important for you to determine as soon as possible. So by default, the shipping company is the ship owner. But you can assume, if that's sufficiently done in line with the definition in the directive, you can assume it to another party, such as the bareboat charterer or to the ship manager. I think one of the challenges at the moment is that it's not completely clear based on the definition of shipping company, whether that is automatically if you have assumed the rights sufficiently, or if this responsibility still needs an additional check the box with the emission authorities. That question has been raised by us with the European Commission, but we're still awaiting the final answer to that one. So once you know that you are the shipping company and that you therefore also have the obligation to comply with EU ETS for the respective ship, then the second thing is to understand where you will be allocated to. So to which emission authority you will get assigned. And from that emission authority, you will also get an operator holding account, and the operator holding account is relevant for trading, but also for complying with EU ETS. In principle, the shipping company, if it has a legal presence in the EU, will report to the emission authority of that respective jurisdiction. And that's different for shipping companies compared to everybody else that is currently subject to ETS. If that's not the case, if you do not have an EU presence, then you would look at the most frequent port of call over the 4 preceding years. So with that, if you're in scope, then you have to report with the respective emission authority before April 1st of 2024 in the respective year. So in this case, we're talking about 2024, a monitoring plan to show to the authorities how you will monitor your emissions for 2024. This has to be approved by the emission authorities. And then once the year is done, you also have to get a verified emission report, and that you also have to submit with the authorities, and based on that they know how much emissions you actually emitted. With respect to the monitoring plan, that's already due April coming year, and the expectation is that the allocation of the respective authorities, respective emission authorities, will only be finalized in February. So that's also a little bit of the challenge with EU ETS for the shipping industry right now, is because it's going to be there as per 1 January of 2024, but a lot of things are not clear at the moment yet. And for example, the assignment of the relevant shipping companies will only take place almost 2 months later. So it means that you have a very short window to submit your monitoring plan. Then once you have a verified emissions report, then you also have to surrender the respective allowances that are due that year. And that has to be done before September 2025 with respect to the emissions of 2024. For the EU EUA acquisition, there will be a phase-in, so ships will not be directly required to surrender EUAs for the full amount of emissions in scope. But for 2024, it will be 40%. For 2025, it will be 70%. And for 2026, it will be completely phased in, and then it will be 100%. Another important element for EU ETS is that voyages that only have one EU port, so that, for example, go from the US into an EU port, are only in scope for 50% of the voyage. Then a couple of things that we would like to point out that you have to watch out for is that if you have a shipping company that is in scope of, based on historical data of MRV, and even if you don't have any EU voyages for 2024, you still have a reporting obligation. The only thing is that the reporting obligation might be that you do not have any emissions, but you still have to report on it. And then also, as also already mentioned briefly, the definition of shipping company is uncertain for certain situations. So the default position is the shipping company is the company with the legal ownership. However, if it's properly assumed, if the responsibility is properly assumed, then it can also be the bareboat charterer or the ship manager. In that respect, I think it's good if we go to the next slide and have a few examples on what shipping company exactly means. So the first example is a most straightforward example. So in this case, the ship owner is also the one that is actually doing all the voyages, and there's no ship manager or ship charterer in place. So in this case, the ship owner is, for example, a Hong Kong entity, which means it doesn't have a presence in the EU. And their most frequent port of call is the Netherlands. In that case, they will get assigned to the Dutch emission authorities, and they will get an operator holding account in the Netherlands. Similar type of example is with respect to Bermuda. In this case, in our example, the most frequent port of call is Greece. If the ship owner is a Spanish company, then it's not relevant what the most frequent port of call is, because then you have an EU presence, and then in principle you're allocated to Spain. What is relevant for you as an organization is, especially if you have multiple ships in multiple entities, is to determine if there is a consistency in it, and if you are very shattered, then it does make sense to see if you can reach out to the emission authorities and ask if there is some sort of option to bundle it and make sure that you reduce the number of authorities that you have to comply to. But these are the general rules. Then the second example is with a ship manager. So with respect to the ship manager, you can assume the responsibility. So let's say the responsibility is sufficiently assumed in line with the definition of shipping company. In that case, the ship manager of the ship that is owned by this Hong Kong entity again is the shipping company. And it also means that the ship manager is the one that gets assigned to an emission authority and gets the operator holding account. This ship is again the ship that has the most frequent port of call in the Netherlands. So in that case, you will get an operator holding account at the Dutch emission authorities. Then you can also have a ship manager, but you don't have have responsibilities properly assigned. So they perform certain services, but it's not in line with the definition. So in that case, the default is the ship owner is the one that is considered the shipping company. The ship owner here in this example is in Spain. and then you also will have a operator holding account in Spain. Then the third example is the ship charterer. So in this case, we again have the Hong Kong ship owner, and we have a bareboat charterer with Malaysia, and the responsibilities are fully assumed. So to the ship charterer, and that means that in that case, the ship charterer is the shipping company under the directive. And it also means that it's the ship company that has to register and comply, and it gets a operator holding account again in the Netherlands. If the ship owner is a Bermuda entity, but it is, for example, a time charterer, then it will remain with the ship owner. Again, that's the default, and it will not transfer because it has not sufficiently assumed the regulatory obligations. And then it is the Bermuda entity that still has to comply with EU ETS. The Bermuda entity had most frequent port of call in Greece, so you get assigned to Greece. And then it doesn't matter that the ship charterer is in Malaysia. Then I think we can go to the next slide. So how does it then work for trading for shipping companies? So Jonathan already briefly explained how the cap and trade system works. Shipping companies don't get any free allowances, so that's zero. So they have emissions in scope, and they have to get EUAs for the full amount that is in scope. They can acquire those EUAs in multiple ways. One is via a company that has free allowances, so has an excess of EUAs. That's an option. But also taking into account how the ETS market will develop, this is probably an option for the coming years, but it's not an option for the longer term. And then the remainder of the EUAs will be traded via an auction, via the EEX, or you can acquire it via a trader that will likely also buy them at the EEX. So that's how you will be able to get your EUAs. Then if we can go to a numerical example. So the European Commission reported that in 2021, there were 11,800 ships that submitted an emission report under the MRV regulation that Mohammed talks about. And that accounted in total for 124.3 million tons of CO2. So that's quite a lot. And if you then look into, let's assume that for 2024, the emissions will be the same. Then you will have the situation that 40% of those emissions are in scope. And of that, we know that about 2/3 is of voyages with only one EU port. So in that case, we would end up with emissions of, and I have to look at my notes here to cheat a little bit. But that would mean that we have emissions in scope of 32 million tons of emissions. And let's say that next year the price of one EUA is 100 euros. That means that the European Union will get 3.2 billion euros based off ETS Maritime. If we then go down and drill this down to ship level, so if we assume that a ship has 10,525 tons of CO2 per annum, that's the emissions in total divided by the number of ships. And let's say that it's completely phased in. So we're talking in this example about 2026. And let's say by then the price rose to 130 euros. Then that would mean that your ship, if it's completely covered by ETS, has to pay almost 1.4 million euros in ETS allowances, so EUAs. And if it's only partially in scope, then that will be 50% of it. But like you can see, we're talking about quite significant numbers. And what the picture on the right-hand side also shows is that it really matters how efficiently you are. So if you're more efficient, then that can have an impact of almost 350,000 euros compared to the baseline in this case. So it is really an incentive to also decarbonize and have less emissions. And it's also very important to consider what this price impact will be, because it will eat away your margins quite quickly. So with that, I think, maybe to one step back, I think for 2026, if we take those same numbers into account and assuming that's fully phased in, then the European Commission will get about 10 billion euros from ETS. So that also quickly rises. And I think from there we can go to the next slide. So then EUA management. So how does that then exactly work? So if you are a shipping company, then the shipping company gets assigned an operator holding account. So this will happen only in February because that's when you get assigned to an emission authority in 2024. And before that, you don't have an operator holding account as a shipping company. Operator holding accounts can be used for trading, and they can be used to surrender the EUAs for compliance obligations. And in that respect, it's different to a trading account because you also have trading accounts. These can be opened in principle by anybody. And the trading accounts, as long as you meet certain conditions, but the trading accounts can only be used for trading. One of the benefits of a trading account is that you can trade slightly quicker. So because the EUA is, of course, a live floating market, it can be interesting to have a trading account to avoid those price risks. But if you are a shipping company, you will get an account assigned that you can use for trading as well. What we do see in the market is that parties are already considering setting up a trading account, and that's important because they already want to acquire those EUAs, and some also expect quite a bit of an increase in EUA price in the coming weeks and months because of this whole maritime sector being added to the ETS system. Then a few other things that need to be considered from a financial perspective with respect to EUAs. EUAs can attract VAT depending on the location and the entity making the acquisition. Transfer pricing principles need to be considered. So, for example, if you have one group entity doing all the trading and you then have to transfer them from that entity to the respective entity that needs to comply, so to the shipping company within your group, that can trigger certain tax implications because of, from a transfer pricing perspective, you have to report an arm's length remuneration for the transfer. And that can also trigger unwanted capital gains or exchange gains, depending on how they are exactly traded. Then also from a commercial perspective, it's very relevant to consider the EUA acquisition. So think about chartering, who is responsible. Those are all elements that you want to take into account from a contractual perspective. And BIMCO is currently working standard clauses for ETS with respect to the contracts. So those will be expected to be available shortly, but I know that it's taking a little bit of time. And then due to the timing difference between EUAs when they're acquired and when they're surrendered, you can also consider the managing that risk. So first of all, understanding who bears the risk and also potentially hedging the risk. So those are also things you can consider also depending on the risk appetite of your organization. And then lastly, accounting. So the accounting treatment really depends, and there's still a lot of uncertainty in that regard. So if we can go maybe to the next slide. Yeah, so ETS has been out there quite a while, as Jonathan said. So since 2005, there is a demand from the market to get more clearance from an accountant's perspective, but it's not there yet. There was IFRIC 3 that gave some guidance, but that was then withdrawn. So that guidance is still not there. And you can have different ways on how certain things are recognized. So, for example, it could potentially be recognized as inventory. It could be recognized as an intangible asset, or in certain matters, it could be recognized as a financial instrument. And that can have certain implications for your financial statements. and with it everything that flows from that. So it's important to consider that as well, and it also depends a bit on how you utilize these EUAs. So from there, I think we can go to the next slide. So some other relevant considerations. One of the things to really consider is that data is key. So you have a lot of things that you need to report upon. And as Mohammed also already pointed out, there's also a lot of new players that are going to be reporting under MRV, and you have to report more things under MRV. So you can consider, for example, the nitrous oxide and methane that has to be reported. And that's quite important to make sure that you have that information. But it also becomes more relevant between parties on what kind of fuel is used, and did you really try your utmost to go to the lowest emissions as possible, especially if you are the one bearing the risk of the financial risk of the EUAs. It's also important to start collecting and making sure that your systems are in place for this properly as soon as possible. And also the collection of EUAs is critical. Start with that on time. Technically, you can buy them just before September, but there's a chance that they are either very expensive by then, and plus the other thing is that there might not be enough EUAs available at that moment in time via the auctioning or via other players to acquire. And if you do not get enough EUAs, then that can potentially result in penalties. Then the second thing I think is very relevant to consider is what would happen is because what we're talking about right now is very short term. So how do you comply? What do you need to do? But the other thing that's very relevant, because we're talking about quite significant amounts here in total, but also per ship, is that shipping companies consider how to reduce their emissions going forward, and that there's a big incentive to decarbonize as quickly as possible. First of all, I think you need to do it to stay relevant. If you do it quicker than your competitors, then there might actually be an advantage there for you. But if you don't do it, then I think these costs, which in principle will be pushed through the value chain as much as possible, might be stuck at your level. So I think it's very important to consider this and to really build a plan for the future to decarbonize and to create operational change. And I think this is one of the things that PwC is positioned really well in helping you develop those kind of plans and to really help you develop a long-term sustainability plan on how to get there. On the one hand, you have the stick, which is ETS, so the fact that you have to pay. On the other hand, you also have subsidies and incentives that need to be taken into account. So I think one of the things to consider is a better utilization of ammonia, hydrogen, biofuels, and other low carbon fuel options, and potentially also CCS, although that does have to meet certain criteria in the ETS directive. But you have to look at that and also look at the opportunities that are there from a subsidy perspective. And also there, PwC can really help you to determine which jurisdictions are you located, what are the local subsidies, what are the EU-related subsidies, and help you with that to decarbonize your fleet, and also help you bridge the gap between the newer available technologies that have lower carbon emissions, but that are currently maybe more costly. But with that come to a good overall project and investment opportunity. And then the last thing is the verification of the emissions. That's also very important. So it makes sense to, I think for the parties in scope for 2024, they most likely already have verifiers, but for the ships in scope as per 2025, so think about the 400 gross ton to 5,000 gross ton ships, make sure that you also have the right verifier in place that can help you with this. So with that, I think then tooling. At PwC, we're also working on tooling. We already had a tool for emissions insights for ETS in general, and we're now building a tool that also gives insights on the financial impact for your fleet, also considering potential options for subsidies. and that's currently under construction. So feel free to reach out, see how we can support, but also we would like to get your input on what you would like to see there so that it tailors our client needs as well. Then I think with that, I'll hand over to Jonathan, who will do a brief key takeaways.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mohammed and Juliet. Just before we dive into the key takeaways, just a reminder, please do submit any questions you have through either the chat function or the Q&A function. We're making good time, so we're very keen to hear kind of what the burning questions are from your perspective. If there's anything that's not clear or that you'd like to hear a discussion on, please do drop them through the chat. All are welcome. In terms of the key takeaways, we want to leave you with 3 things today, or 4 if you include the reminder. The reminder being that the EU ETS applies to the maritime transport sector in less than 6 weeks. So today is the 16th of November, so it applies very soon. Before the 1st of January 2024, so within those next 6 weeks, there are a few things that you can do. You can look at your fleet and determine which ships are in scope and who you think the shipping company would be for each of those ships. You can have a look at who is likely to bear the financial responsibility for the EU ETS and whether that's the EUA acquisition itself via the shipping company or if it's a cash payment. You can look at which jurisdiction you're likely to have the shipping company allocated to if you don't have a legal presence within the European Union. And you can also do a sort of high-level quantification of the financial impact and what you expect. So if you can do all that before the 1st of January, you can enter into the EU ETS with a relatively good understanding of what this might mean for you, your fleet and your organisation. And that can also equip you quite well to engage with authorities, whether it's the competent authority that you've been assigned or relevant counterparties. So there's quite a bit that can be done today. With that in mind, we encourage you to be proactive. As was said by Mohammed, a lot of the ships which are in scope of the MRV, they will already be reporting a lot of this information. And so there should be a baseline process for those larger vessels already in place, noting that, of course, the MRV will expand to include other greenhouse gases and other ships. And just don't forget that the EU ETS is actually a directive. And so for those who aren't familiar, in the EU, we have a regulation and a directive. A directive, what that means is that it does require local implementation. And so whilst the directive is published and it should be fairly standard, it may be tweaked slightly for each jurisdiction when it gets entered into their national law. And so that's something to keep a very close eye on in the next few weeks. So with that in mind, we will now go to the question section. So as I said, please feel free to submit them either via the chat or the Q&A function. I've got a few here. So Mohammed, I might start with you, and this question is on scope. So do we think that car ferry operators are in scope? Oh, might be on mute, Mohammed.
Jonathan, thanks. What are car carriers?
I think we can assume they're probably RoPax ships, so roll-on, roll-off passenger ships.
Those are in scope, right? So if they meet that 5,000 tonnage minimum, then they should be in scope.
Yep, fully agree. And then it also might be worth mentioning that even if they're under that gross tonnage, they might be in MRV from 2025.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got another question here, and Juliet, I'll pass this to you, but also Erwin, keen to see whether you have any insights on this. What would be the incentive for a ship manager to assume responsibility? Maybe Juliet, I'll go to you first.
Yeah. So what we do see is that some companies have a multitude of ships, and then those ships are managed by one ship manager. And if you have a ship manager that takes care of all these ships, and you make that ship manager the shipping company, then at least the one that knows all the data and is responsible for reporting on that is also the one that has the compliance obligation under ETS. So from there, it makes sense to consider if this is the way that you do business, to also make sure that your ship manager is the one that is the shipping company, because otherwise you start transferring, you potentially start transferring EUAs within the group. And with that, I'll hand it over to Erwin, who can explain why that is potentially not the best idea.
I think you're now pointing to tax consequences as well, but I think from a business perspective, if you as a ship manager have all the data, and it's very efficient to then be reporting it, and you might be even charging the ship owner a fee for it, for the administrative work. because of course the ship manager doesn't necessarily have to be an entity that is part of the same group. It could be somebody else as well. And indeed, if it's within the group, shifting either responsibilities or not, let's say, remunerating for activities might have a tax impact. So I think from an incentive point of view, if from a commercial arrangement you would be able to charge for it, that's always something that you could do. And perhaps even within the group, it's something that you should do for tax purposes. So.
Yeah. And maybe sticking on that theme of tax purposes, there's a great question here from Daniel, which maybe Juliet, I'll pose to you. How do the EEA countries fit into this? And then the second part of that question is, does legal presence only apply to corporate residency, or is it also tax residency?
Yeah, so maybe start off with the first one. So the EEA countries are also part of the ETS system. And then you also have Switzerland that is also has an ETS system that is to a certain extent linked to the ETS system of the European Union or the EEA countries. So from an EEA perspective, they will also be in scope for the maritime sector. So for example, Norway will be in as well. But there are other jurisdictions. So think about, for example, the UK that have an ETS system, but that's not automatically linked because the UK has not made that decision yet, or the European Union and the UK have not made that decision yet. So there are different systems but for EEA countries, this is also applicable. And then with respect to legal presence only or corporate residency, so corporate residency or tax residency, my understanding of the current reading of the directive is that it refers to legal presence and not necessarily to tax residency. But yeah, because that's a different term and this is not defined in that manner in the directive. Yeah, I think that's where it currently stands. But there's also, like I said, still some uncertainty how certain things should be explained in practice.
Yeah, I think on that, Juliet, what you could also have, of course, is that we have a shipping company that is sitting abroad, so not in the European Union, but has ships that do a voyage to the European Union. And what you could do in that case is that you could register that a foreign company in the European Union in the specific country with the Dutch Chamber of Commerce or with any other Chamber of Commerce, for example, to open a trading account. So in that specific case, I'm not talking about the account holder account, but for example, for the trading account, you can have that registration to be done with, the local Chamber of Commerce. And then basically you are registering the foreign entity without having actual presence, in Europe, which is not required. So that is also something that that is put in place in the ETS legislation.
Yeah, and I think maybe to tie into that, Mohammed, that is something that we are indeed helping clients with. So one of the things is that you can indeed register at the Chamber of Commerce. What we do see the challenge to be, especially if we talk about trading accounts, is that if you want to open a trading account, the emission authorities also require you to have an EU bank account. And non-EU companies quite often do not have an EU bank account. Opening an EU bank account is technically possible, but in practice quite often takes a while. So we also have alternatives there that we discuss with our clients on how to speed up that process and have certain services in place that help you provide that bank account without creating an actual legal presence for your company in the EU or without creating a taxable presence in the EU. But for that, if that's something of interest, please reach out because we're happy to talk about that in more detail with you.
And that last part, Juliet, I think that raises a really interesting observation in terms of the EU ETS isn't just a question for the operations team or the shipping logistics team, right? It's a question for the finance team. It's a question for the tax team. And you really do need to bring sort of a coordinated effort to this. Otherwise, take that example of the registration of a trading account. You can have sort of funky or adverse outcomes popping up here and there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Jonathan. Good point. I think also, because I also mentioned that these costs will likely be pushed through the whole value chain. I think this is in principle relevant for the maritime sector because they are confronted with all these costs and the compliance obligations. But in the longer term, it's important for the entire value chain because most of these costs will be pushed through, make the cost of transport higher, and with that the cost of goods increase. So it's not only relevant for the maritime sector as such, it's relevant for everybody that ships cargo or passengers. And does that with larger ships. And as we saw in the picture that Mohammed showed, there is quite a lot of that going on globally.
Indeed. And we've probably got a time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So please, if you have anything burning, do send them through to us. But I've got one here. Maybe, Mohammed, I'll pass this to you in the first instance. And so what happens if I have a ship owned by an EU legal entity, but the ship itself never enters the waters of the European Union?
Let me see. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Jonathan?
Yeah, so this is looking at whether, so if I've got a ship that's owned by a European company, but it's never enters the waters of the European Union, I think the question here is what is a voyage? How is that defined? And is it the voyages or is it the ownership that brings you in scope?
Well, it's basically the voyages, of course. So if you do not have any voyages at the European territory, then you are out of scope for the EU ETS.
Yeah, albeit you may be owned by an EU legal entity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I see also another question in the chat. I think that's about the incentive. So what would be the incentive for ship managers to assume responsibility? Not sure if you've already touched base on that, but I think
We did.
Oh, we did, indeed. Yeah, because that's more from a practical point of view, indeed, rather than having each separate ship owner to, register themselves separately. As perhaps also an interesting one that's more on the subsidies, because of course we're now talking about the ETS, which is more on the cost, so the pain. There are indeed quite some subsidies, and we see quite some developments in the shipping sector, for example, going to methane, CCS. But an important element there is that those subsidies are applicable to you, but only if those ships are basically on the balance sheet of a company that is actually located in the EU. So that is something to bear in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. And maybe with the last question, I'll throw to Juliet, and this is a bit of a broad one to close us out. So we've spoken a lot today around various different issues, and other than just talking about it, and obviously we had the tooling example earlier, what can PwC do to assist with the EU ETS and the MRV?
Yeah, so I think what we can do on the short term is really help you define whether you're the shipping company, who has what compliance obligations, what kind of costs are related for your company in the short and longer term future. But I think, and also highlighted during the presentation itself, I think one of the other key things, and I think that's where PwC is positioned really well, is that we can help you with the longer term vision. Like help you how to decarbonize, to see what kind of opportunities are out there, how to utilize subsidies and incentives, and really help you build a plan to decarbonize and to your fleet.
Great, thank you, Julia. And I think with that, I'll hand back over to Erwin to wrap us up and close us out.
Sure. Well, thank you everybody for joining our webinar. I hope it has provided the valuable insights that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. It is clear also based on the key takeaways and the presentation, this is going to happen in 6 weeks' time. And so if you have these vessels or if your clients have these vessels that are in scope, you will be impacted, and it's really time to act now. So hopefully we've made that clear. Should there be any other questions or remarks, or in case you would like to discuss, feel free to reach out to one of the presenters or to myself. With that, wishing you a very good day, and thanks again for joining. Perhaps see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.